Welcome, friends. Tonight we're setting off on a soft, slightly ridiculous journey into the wonderful world of medieval European and unknown stories. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, so settle in. Fluff your pillow. Maybe light a candle. Let's dim the lights and take a deep, relaxing breath. When we think of medieval times, we often picture knights in shining armor, epic battles and towering castles. But what about love? What was dating like in the medieval world, where fairy tale romance is contrasted by the harsh realities of political alliances, land inheritances, and religious decrees? In this video, we'll explore how people navigated love, courtship, and marriage in medieval times. We'll take you on a journey through the social structures, the role of the church, the differences between the noble and common folk, and the way dating was seen through the lens of societal duty rather than personal desire. From formal courtship rituals to arranged marriages, let's dive into the complexities of what dating really looked like in the medieval world. Section 1. Pre-marriage stage in medieval times, how women and men met and how they decided to marry. The concept of dating, as we know it today, did not exist in medieval times. Instead, marriage was a carefully orchestrated process that was deeply embedded in the social, religious, and economic fabric of the era. Here's a detailed exploration of how men and women met before marriage, the role of their families, and the process by which they decided to marry. 1. Social context and the importance of marriage. In medieval society, marriage was seen not as a personal or romantic choice, but as a social, political, and economic necessity. Marriages were arranged to form alliances, secure property, produce heirs, and maintain the social hierarchy. As a result, the idea of love as the primary motivator for marriage was a concept far removed from the realities of the time. Families, wealth, and land. For the nobility, marriages were often about consolidating power, land, and wealth. A family's position within the social structure was largely determined by its alliances through marriage. The higher one's social class, the more critical the selection of a partner became. For common folk, marriage was often more about survival and economic necessity, creating a stable family unit to work the land and produce heirs. Role of the church. Religion played a central role in marriage. The Catholic Church viewed marriage as a sacrament and decreed that it should be entered into with the approval of both families, ideally with the blessing of the clergy. Premarital sex was forbidden, and couples were expected to wait until marriage for any physical intimacy. Courtship and marriage, therefore, had a formalized structure in which religious rituals and ceremonies took precedence. 2. The role of families in meeting and courtship. The most crucial factor in how people met in medieval times was the role their families played in orchestrating relationships. Unlike today, where individuals often meet through social events, workplaces, or online platforms, medieval couples were usually introduced through family connections or community events. Arranged marriages. For both noble and common families, marriage was a matter of strategy and family interest. It was rare for a man or woman to marry solely for love or personal preference. In noble families, marriage arrangements were negotiated by parents, or sometimes the entire family, with the help of intermediaries. Fathers were especially involved in the process, as it was often the head of the family who negotiated the dowry, land exchanges, and the political advantages of a marriage. Commoners had slightly more freedom in choosing a partner, but the process was still heavily influenced by family. A couple might meet through their families during public celebrations, fairs, or religious events, but their union was still often subject to parental approval. In the case of Eleanor of Aquitaine, her marriage to Louis VII of France was arranged by her family to strengthen their political ties. After the marriage was annulled, Eleanor's family played a significant role in arranging her second marriage to Henry II of England, further consolidating their wealth and power. Before formal marriages could take place, there was the practice of a betrothal, where a formal agreement was made between the families. This often occurred long before the wedding, sometimes even in childhood. Betrothals were legally binding contracts, and once betrothed, a woman was considered promised to her future husband, although the marriage ceremony itself could take years to arrange. 3. How women and men met. For the nobility, courtships were formal affairs that took place in the context of large gatherings, such as tournaments, feasts, or royal courts. For commoners, however, social gatherings were more localized, occurring at markets, fairs, religious festivals, or village celebrations. Noble courtship. In the noble class, young women and men would meet during public events such as royal balls, hunting parties, feasts, or jousting tournaments. At these events, the courtly practice of chivalric love was in full display, where knights would publicly express their admiration for noble women, often in highly stylized and formal ways. This was more about winning a woman's favor through valor and bravery, rather than private or personal conversations. Eading martyr. Men and women in noble families were often closely monitored by their families and attendants. Any interaction was subject to social rules, and chaperones were always present to maintain propriety. The court of King Arthur and the tales of Lancelot and Guinevere illustrate the notion of courtly love. The knights, including Lancelot, often expressed their devotion to ladies in dramatic ways, such as jousting or writing poetry, though their actual relationships were often far more political than the literature would suggest. Courtship for commoners. For commoners, courtship was less formal and families were often much more involved in the process. Young men and women might meet during work hours in the fields, at local markets, or at community events like harvest festivals or religious holidays. Women had more freedom to choose their suitor, but the process was still highly supervised by their families, especially the women's fathers or brothers. In village life, festivals, fairs, and religious gatherings were crucial spaces where young people could meet. It wasn't unusual for women to be courted during such events, though they were often under the watchful eyes of chaperones. The exchange of gifts, such as flowers or tokens, was a common feature in early courtship. Jean and Marie, both peasants from a small French village, first met at the local harvest festival, where they danced together and exchanged small tokens of affection. Their relationship grew over time as they worked alongside each other in the fields. Eventually, they both gained the approval of their families, and their union was celebrated by their community. While their marriage wasn't arranged, it still had the blessing of their families, particularly because they both contributed to the stability of their household. 4. Deciding to marry, the role of consent. While the families had the final say in most medieval marriages, personal consent was still part of the equation. The extent to which individuals had a say in their marriage varied depending on their social status, but in most cases, they had to express their willingness to marry their intended spouse. Consent and the role of the church. The church played a key role in marriage decisions. Before the wedding ceremony, a priest might ask both parties if they consented to the marriage. This was a formal part of the marriage ceremony, to ensure both individuals agreed to the union, but it was more of a religious formality than an act of free choice, especially in arranged marriages. Noble families and political unions. For the nobility, marriage decisions were primarily political. Women particularly had little control over who they married, as their marriages were more about securing family alliances than fulfilling personal desires. They might express reluctance to marry, but the pressure from family and social expectations made it difficult for women to refuse an arranged match. Isabella of France, who was married to Edward II of England, was married for political reasons to secure a French-English alliance. She had little control over the decision, though later in her life she played a significant role in politics, even leading a revolt against her husband. Commoner marriages. For commoners, the decision to marry often involved a deeper personal connection, though still influenced by family. A man and woman might express mutual affection through informal courtship, but the decision to marry was always approved by their families. If a young couple were in love and wanted to marry, they would usually seek the blessing of their parents, especially the woman's father. Even in love marriages, it was necessary to ensure the union would be socially and economically stable for both parties. Anecdote. Alice, a peasant girl, and Bertrand, a young farm worker, had known each other since childhood. They had been courting for several months before they decided they wanted to marry. Alice's father, initially skeptical about Bertrand's ability to provide for her, eventually agreed after seeing how hard the young man worked. Together, they created a stable home and farmed the land to support their growing family. Section 2. The social structure of medieval times. In medieval Europe, society was organized in a strict hierarchy, and your place in this hierarchy significantly influenced your opportunities for romantic relationships, Whether you were a king or a common peasant, your social class determined how you interacted with others, especially when it came to relationships. At the top of the social structure were the nobility, the kings, queens, lords, and ladies. They were the ruling class, and their marriages were seen less as a union of love and more as a strategic alliance to maintain power, wealth, and land. Below them, the common folk were peasants who worked the land, often with little or no control over their marriages. And the clergy, such as monks and priests, had their own rules when it came to relationships, heavily influenced by the church's teachings on chastity and celibacy. Marriage, especially among the upper classes, was often viewed as a business transaction rather than a union based on affection. For the nobles, it was a way to secure power, wealth, and family alliances. For the common folk, marriage was necessary for survival, and often romantic love had little place in the equation. So we all know that medieval Europe was divided into a rigid social hierarchy, which was largely determined by birth, wealth, and occupation. This stratification dictated the roles of men and women, the relationships between different classes, and, most importantly, how marriage was viewed and conducted. The key classes in medieval society were: Section 3. The importance of marriage in medieval times. Marriage in medieval times was one of the most significant social, economic, and religious events in an individual's life. It was not merely a personal choice, but a public and legal institution that ensured the stability of the family unit and the broader social order. Marriage as a political and economic tool for the nobility. For the nobility, marriage was an essential part of managing political power and wealth. A marriage alliance could secure territories, create powerful alliances, and strengthen a family's position in the social hierarchy. Marrying a daughter to a powerful king, prince, or noble family could mean the expansion of land, increased wealth, and military strength. Dowries, land agreements, and political promises were often the driving forces in noble marriages, overshadowing personal affection. The marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Louis VII of France was arranged to consolidate power. When their marriage was annulled, Eleanor married Henry II of England, further expanding her own wealth and influence in Europe. This marriage cemented her place as one of the most powerful women of her time. Marriage as a religious sacrament. The Catholic Church viewed marriage as a sacred sacrament, one that should be entered into for the purpose of creating a family and producing legitimate heirs. The Church taught that marriage was a union between a man and a woman, and that both partners were obligated to be faithful, produce children, and provide mutual support. The Church also held considerable power over marriage contracts and could annul marriages or declare them invalid if certain criteria were not met, example forced marriages, marriages between close relatives, etc. Marriage for the survival and stability of the peasantry. For the common folk, marriage was about survival. Peasant marriages ensured the continuation of family farms, stability in the village, and the production of heirs to work the land. A marriage brought together two families, often merging labour resources and property. It also guaranteed the stability of the community. While love was a factor, the financial and social benefits of marriage were often the most important aspects. Families had to be sure that a marriage would not disrupt their livelihood and that the union would result in stable, productive offspring. Jean and Marie, two peasants in medieval France, met during the harvest festival. Though their love blossomed over time, the marriage was also practical. Together, they could work the land and secure their future. Their marriage provided mutual financial benefit and ensured that their land would be worked for generations. Marriage as social status. Marriage was a clear indication of social status. For nobles, marrying into another powerful family elevated their own standing in society. For peasants and commoners, a good marriage could provide the opportunity for upward mobility. Women, in particular, had their social status often tied to their marriage. A woman's reputation and honor were deeply entwined with the behavior of her husband. For the merchant class, marriage was an opportunity to solidify one's position in society by securing wealth or a prestigious family name. The positive and negative aspects of marriage in medieval times. The positive aspects of marriage: social and economic stability. Marriage brought stability to individuals and their families, ensuring a steady flow of resources, labor, and protection. In the case of the nobility, marriage could increase wealth and power, as land and dowries were exchanged. For common folk, marriage could offer a sense of security and protection, both physically and economically, by uniting two families in mutual support. Strengthening alliances. Marriages, especially among the upper classes, were vital for forming and maintaining political alliances. These alliances often determined the fate of entire kingdoms or regions. The marriage of Isabella of Castile to Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 united Spain under one monarchy, which eventually paved the way for Spain's dominance in Europe. Religious fulfillment. For religious believers, marriage was a sacred union, a divine ordinance meant to bring man and woman together to bear children, build families, and fulfill God's purpose. The religious sacrament of marriage gave couples a sense of spiritual purpose, and in some cases, marriages were seen as a means of fulfilling God's will. Security for women. In a time when women had limited rights and opportunities, marriage provided social legitimacy and protection. A married woman had more rights than a single one, especially in terms of property ownership and social standing. Marriage could also offer women the chance to gain access to wealth and resources through their husband's family. The negative aspects of marriage: limited autonomy for women. Women had very little choice in their marriages, especially among the nobility. For most, their consent was secondary to familial and political arrangements. Their lives were often dictated by the whims of their fathers, brothers, and husbands, leaving little room for personal preference. A woman's primary role was often limited to bearing children and managing the household. Economic and social pressure. While marriage provided economic stability, it also came with immense pressure. For the lower classes, the inability to secure a suitable marriage could result in poverty or social shame. For the nobility, the pressure to produce heirs to inherit family estates and titles was overwhelming, and failure to do so could lead to scandals or disputes over succession. Marriages for political gain. For nobles, marriage could often feel more like a business arrangement than a personal union. While alliances were necessary for political survival, they also led to strained personal relationships. For example, marriages like that of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, though based on love initially, soured over time due to the lack of a male heir and political maneuvering, adultery, and infidelity. Infidelity, though frowned upon, was a known issue in medieval marriages. For men, especially among the upper classes, there was more tolerance for extramarital affairs. For women, however, infidelity was severely punished, leading to harsh consequences like divorce or social ostracism. Section 4. Gender roles and expectations in medieval times. In medieval Europe, gender roles were strictly defined and deeply embedded in the societal structure. These roles dictated how men and women interacted, behaved, and were expected to fulfill their duties within family, marriage, and society at large. Gender played a pivotal role in shaping the dynamics of marriage, courtship, and social standing. The role of women in medieval society. The role of women in medieval society was largely shaped by religion, tradition, and patriarchy. Women's lives were generally confined to the domestic sphere, and their primary duties revolved around child-rearing, household management, and supporting their husbands. While some women, especially those in the upper classes, could engage in more public affairs, their primary identity was tied to their roles as wives and mothers. Marriage as a woman's destiny. From a young age, women were prepared for their roles as wives and mothers. Marriage was seen as a woman's ultimate purpose, and it was rare for women to remain unmarried, especially among the nobility. Unmarried women, particularly noble women, could be seen as an anomaly or a source of scandal, as they were not fulfilling their perceived societal duty. Example: in many legal texts and church teachings, women were described as the weaker vessel, meaning that they needed the protection and guidance of men. The idea of female submission was deeply rooted in medieval society. Limited public life and education. While noble women were sometimes educated in the arts of diplomacy, literature, and managing estates, the education of most women was focused on household skills. They were generally not allowed to participate in political life or public affairs. This exclusion was compounded by their limited access to higher education, particularly compared to men. The role of men in medieval society. Men, in contrast to women, were expected to provide, protect, and lead both their families and the broader community. From a young age, boys were trained in the arts of war, leadership, and managing land and resources, preparing them to take over family estates or lead military campaigns. The role of men in society was more public, with a focus on expanding family wealth and political influence. The role of the head of the household. The man was the head of the household. He was responsible for making decisions, protecting his family's wealth, and ensuring that his property and social standing were maintained. He could arrange marriages for his children to secure alliances or manage land disputes, and he was the one who publicly represented his family's interests. Example: a noble father making strategic decisions about his daughter's marriages, negotiating with another lord or monarch for an advantageous union. He considers wealth, land, and political alliances over personal feelings. Public life and social expectations. Men were expected to engage in public life, whether through military service, political leadership, or by managing estates. Military service was highly valued, especially for knights, who were trained from a young age to fight in battles and uphold the honor of their families. Manhood and marriage. Marriage for men was not only a personal choice but also a social duty. A man's ability to marry and maintain a household reflected his status and capabilities. Noblemen sought wives who would bring dowries, lands, and political advantages to their family. A man's legacy depended heavily on producing heirs, particularly male heirs, to inherit his lands and continue his bloodline. Example: a nobleman considering potential brides for his son, evaluating the size of dowries and the alliances that could be made through marriage. This decision was more about securing family wealth and legacy than about personal affection. Marriage, a balance of duty and gender expectations. Marriage in medieval times was deeply influenced by the roles men and women were expected to play. These roles were not only about familial duty, but also about reputation and honor within society. Both men and women were bound by societal expectations that governed their behavior and their roles as spouses. Women's role as wives and mothers. A woman's primary role in marriage was to be a supportive wife and a mother. The medieval church stressed that the purpose of marriage was to produce children, and a wife was expected to manage the household, care for the children, and ensure that the home ran smoothly. Women were also expected to be chaste, obedient, and submissive to their husbands. Men's role as providers and protectors. Men, by contrast, were expected to be the protectors and providers. They were responsible for the financial well-being of the family, managing estates, and ensuring that their wives and children had everything they needed. They were also expected to engage in public life, whether in the courts, on the battlefield, or in service to the king. The strict gender roles of medieval times created a society where men were the dominant figures in public life, while women's roles were confined largely to the private sphere, particularly in marriage. Men were expected to provide and protect, while women were seen as caretakers of the home and family. These roles shaped every aspect of their lives, including how marriages were arranged, how they interacted with each other, and the duties they fulfilled within the institution of marriage. The gender dynamics of the medieval world ensured a rigid societal structure that lasted for centuries. Section 5. The role of religion in dating and marriage. Religion, particularly Catholicism, played a central role in dating and marriage in medieval times. The Church's influence shaped every aspect of marital unions, from courtship to the wedding ceremony itself, establishing strict rules on what was considered a legitimate marriage, how couples should behave before and after marriage, and the moral obligations that came with it. Marriage as a religious sacrament. Marriage was considered one of the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church, which meant that it was seen as a divine institution ordained by God. Unlike today, when marriages may or may not be religious, medieval marriages were bound by the Church's laws, and the spiritual aspect was paramount. Church approval. For a marriage to be legitimate, it had to be sanctioned by the Church. This required both partners to be baptized Christians and for the marriage to be conducted in a church. Marriages without the Church's approval were considered invalid. which could have significant social and legal consequences. Even noble families had to seek the church's blessing, making marriage a public and religious act. The sacrament of marriage. The Catholic Church viewed marriage as a way to bring a husband and wife closer to God. Through this sacrament, they were expected to be faithful, chaste, and productive, with the primary goal being the procreation of children. The Church's teachings on marriage emphasized the moral and spiritual duties of both partners to each other and to God. The role of the Church in courtship and marital choice. The Catholic Church not only oversaw marriage ceremonies, but also dictated the rules governing courtship and marital arrangements. Courtship and chastity. The Church strongly emphasized chastity before marriage. Premarital sex was viewed as a mortal sin, and the Church enforced strict guidelines on the interaction between men and women. Young men and women were often chaperoned by family members or trusted servants during courtship, and interactions between potential suitors were heavily monitored. Anecdote. In some cases, letters of intent or promises of marriage had to be made publicly before the Church. These promises served as a form of premarital commitment that held individuals to their word, and breaking these promises was considered sinful. Arranged marriages and church involvement. Marriages were usually arranged by families, especially among the nobility. While the couple might not have had much say in the choice of their spouse, the Church often played an active role in ensuring the marriage met the moral and religious standards. The Church's involvement in arranged marriages provided a layer of legitimacy to the unions, and even minor disputes between families could be mediated by local clergy to ensure the marriage was in accordance with religious laws. Wedding rituals and religious significance. The wedding day was the pinnacle of a marriage, and it was laden with religious significance. For the Church, the ceremony was not just a social contract, but a spiritual joining. The wedding ceremony. The wedding ceremony was often conducted in a church, with the priest officiating. The vows taken by the bride and groom were solemn and included promises of fidelity, love, and respect. The couple's vows were seen as a covenant before God. In some cases, Holy Communion was taken during the ceremony to signify the couple's spiritual union. The exchange of rings and vows were seen as both a social and religious commitment. In some cases, the Church required that the marriage be publicly announced to ensure that no one was coerced into the union. Blessing of the marriage. The priest would bless the couple, asking for God's grace on their union. This blessing was seen as a vital component of the marriage. It wasn't just a social contract, but a religious union that could not be broken unless by a divine declaration, such as the death of one of the spouses or a church annulment. Religious influence on marital life. Once married, the couple's life together was also shaped by the Church's teachings. Roles within the marriage. The Church prescribed gender roles within the marriage. The husband was seen as the head of the household, responsible for providing and protecting his family. The wife was expected to be submissive, managing the household and bearing children. The Church taught that women's primary role was to support their husbands, raise children, and ensure the spiritual upbringing of their family. Fidelity and the dangers of infidelity. Adultery was considered a grave sin, particularly for women, who could face severe consequences, including being shunned by society. For men, though adultery was still sinful, it was often more tolerated and sometimes ignored by the clergy, especially if the affair was with a lower status woman. The double standard between the treatment of men and women in matters of fidelity became a point of contention in medieval society. Church-controlled annulments and divorce. While the Church disapproved of divorce, it did allow for annulments under certain circumstances. An annulment declared that the marriage was never valid in the first place, usually based on the claim that one or both parties had entered into it for the wrong reasons, for example, or consanguinity. This process allowed a marriage to be legally dissolved, but it was not granted easily, and it often required the intervention of high-ranking clergy. A famous example. One of the most famous annulments in history was the case of Henry VIII of England and Catherine of Aragon. Henry VIII sought an annulment from the Pope because Catherine failed to produce a male heir. The refusal of the Pope to annul the marriage led to England's break with the Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England. Religion in medieval times was deeply interwoven with marriage, and the Church had immense power over the process. From courtship to wedding ceremonies, the religious authority dictated what was morally acceptable, ensuring marriages were aligned with God's will. While it provided legitimacy, stability, and a moral framework for marital life, the Church's influence also reinforced gender roles and limitations on personal choice, making marriage more about duty than personal love in the medieval world. So, what can we learn from medieval dating customs? While the medieval era may seem like a distant past, many aspects of medieval courtship still influence modern relationships. In modern society, we still see the impact of family influence in relationships, especially in cultures where arranged marriages are still common. Additionally, the idea of marriage as a social contract rather than purely an emotional connection can still be seen in many parts of the world. However, the freedom of choice and the concept of marrying for love, which is so common today, was almost non-existent in medieval times. The medieval era's strong emphasis on duty and duty-bound marriages has evolved into the more individualistic and personal approach to relationships we see in modern-day society. In medieval times, dating wasn't about romantic gestures or finding a soulmate. It was about survival, securing alliances, and building legacies. While courtly love and idealized romance played a role in literature, for most, marriage was a means to an end, a way to protect property, wealth, and political power. Despite the differences, there's something timeless about the human desire for connection. Whether in the medieval courts or in today's world, love, marriage, and courtship remain powerful forces in shaping our lives. And with that, dear listener, we gently close the final page of tonight's journey through the dating stage. No, skip the date. Go straight to the marriage and a shimmering past. Whether you now dream of silken gowns or scented pomanders, may your sleep be sweet and your imagination soft as velvet. Thank you for joining us. Rest well, take care of your beautiful self, whatever that means to you, and until next time, good night.